So we have various types of CSS selector. Types of CSS selector. Number one, we have element selector, we have ID selector, we have class selector, we have grouping selector, and lastly we have universal selector. Now let's move on to the first one that we just made mention of now, which is the element selector. Now the element selector refers to the actual element selector you specify on the HTML page. Okay, so when we talk about the element selector, based on the HTML element you have on your file. So for example, you have an HTML element called paragraph. So you go down to your CSS rule set, and in the place of the selector you take that paragraph and you insert it right there. So the moment you have it there, every of your styling begins to reflect on that CSS, on that HTML element. So that's it about the element selector, just the way we have it in our previous illustrations that we did in the course of this class. So if you come down to our CSS file, what we have here, we have the H1. So the H1 is the heading one. We have the stylings that we have here. So this is a very good example of the element selector. Also we have the paragraph selected here. So every styling we have here immediately will be reflected on the HTML element. So that's it about the element selector. Number two, we have the ID selector. Now the ID selector are unique. They are used to select elements on the page that has a specific ID. So the ID are unique and can only have one element per ID on the page. Okay, so you can't use the same ID by multiple elements on that file. For instance, we have an element, for example. So you want to style that particular element, you're going to use an attribute ID. So you give the ID a value. Now that same value you gave the ID, you take that value to the selector area of the CSS. Then that same value, you have it there. In that same value, at the front of that value, you are going to put a character. What character are you going to have there? You're going to have the hash character at the front of the value. Then you open the curly brace and insert your styling. The moment you do that, immediately it reflects on the HTML element, and you are good to go from there. Very, very importantly, please, when you have that particular styling done, the value of that styling, for example, maybe you have the name of the ID, name quote. Now that quote of a name cannot be used in another element. So that's just what we have to say about that. You can use that same ID on multiple HTML elements. It's very important that you know that. Okay, so shortly we are going to start an illustration about the ID. Now let's move on to the class selector. So the class selector is similar to the ID selector but can be referenced multiple times. Can declare a class selector and can be used on several HTML elements on the page. And also the class selector is characterized with a period or a dot, just the way we have it in an ID selector. What you need to do is to create a class attribute on the element, and you give the element, the attribute, a value. So for instance, you have the name of that particular class attribute, you give it the value of A. So you go to your CSS styling, and at the front of the A you put a period or a dot, then you have the A at the front of the dot. Then you open your curly brace and you put the styling there. Immediately the dot A goes to look for and goes to find and select the element that has the value of A, the element that has the attribute class and the value of A. So the moment it selects that, it styles that element with the required styling you have there. So that's it about the class selector. Now we have the grouping selector. That's the fourth one. The grouping selector selects multiple elements and group them together to apply the styling. So just the way we have it in our previous illustration, we've done that before. So we group them on the same selector. For example, you want to style more than one element, so you just take those element name, you take the class, and you differentiate them with a comma at the front as at the selector area. For example, right here we have the P, we have the LI. So that is all we need to know about the grouping selector. So it's quite very simple. You just group them together, differentiating them with a comma, then you style the element. That's all you need to know about the grouping selector. Lastly, we have the universal selector. The universal selector selects all the elements on the page, and it is characterized with a star character. So we use the asterisk. Let's use the word asterisk. Asterisk is a very good word. We use the asterisk to characterize that particular universal selector. So what you just do at the selector area of your rule set, you just put an asterisk there, and you open the curly brace and put the styling. The moment you have that in place, it styles everything you have on the page at once. So that's just the benefit of the universal selector. It's just like using the body as a selector. The body styles the entire page. It styles the entire page you have on that HTML document. Okay, so the universal selector, represented with an asterisk, styles the entire page of the HTML document. Alright, so that's all you need to know about the selector. So we talked about the element, we talked about ID, we talked about class, grouping, and universal selector. So shortly we are going to be doing something with this. We've done some stuff with the H1, that's the element selector. So we have an H1 here, and we've done the grouping selector right here. We've done something on the H1, that's the element selector. So the next thing we are going to do here, let's work on how to use the ID selector. Now what I'm going to do here, I'm going to go down to where we have a paragraph here. Okay, so I'm going to use the ID attribute. I'm going to give it a value of quote. Now this particular element, I have the ID attributes in this element and the value of quote. Now this quote now cannot be used in another element. Okay, just the way we explained it initially. The ID is a unique selector. Okay, and the moment you use it in a specific element, specifying the ID, it cannot be used the same. It cannot be used in another element. Okay, so it's a very unique. It's unique to the document and cannot be used in any other place. So let's go down to our CSS styling, and we have the character hash. Okay, the moment you have hash there, it goes to find the ID. Then we have the quotes. Okay, oh, I wrongly spelled that. So alright, we have the quotes. You open the curly brace, and there you go. So what am I going to do here? I'm going to use a font style, font hyphen style. I want to give it an italic. Okay, so save. Then let's go back and check if the spellings are correct. Okay, the quote in the HTML, okay, is correct. So let's go down to our browser and let me put down here. Okay, so reload. Okay, so we see that it's reflecting quite well. Okay, so this is another paragraph tag. Is now in an italic form, slanty text. Okay, that's just what we did about that. So the ID selector is working effectively. Now let's move on to the class selector. Now the class selector, I'm going to use this as an example. So I have the class attribute here. I'm going to use the para as the value. So in the h1 also I'm going to use the class para. So I told you the class selector is similar to the ID selector, but it can be referenced multiple times, okay, and can be declared, can be referenced multiple times in that particular document. Okay, not just in the ID selector, it can't be referenced multiple times. The same ID you use, the same element you pass in an ID for, that's the only element that particular ID can work for. But in the case of the class selector, the class can be referenced in more than one element, just the way we have it in this illustration. We have the paragraph, we have a class passing there, and the h2 we have a class passing there also. Now let's go down to our CSS. We have now we're going to characterize that with a period, that's a dot. So we have the para. Okay, so firstly let's change the size, font size. Let's give it 35 pixel. Okay, now we give it a color of blue, yeah. And lastly, let's give that a text decoration. Let's give it a line. Let's take it to the center, okay, so we can see what is really happening there. Okay, now we have the font size to 35 pixel, we have the color to blue, then lastly we have the property text align with the value center. Now let's go back to the HTML document to see if we have any wrongly spelled class. Okay, it's rightly spelled. Now we are good to check this on our browser, save, and come down to the browser and reload. Okay, so look at this, we have it already reflecting on our web page. Now let's try to expand this web page. Okay, just the way we have it there, we have the font size to be 35 pixels, so that's why we have it more larger, we have it the size more bigger. Now we have the color to be blue, we have here the color is obviously blue. Then lastly we took it to the center, we have the property text align center, so that's what we have here. The alignment is already centered on the web page. Alright, so that's it about the class selector. So lastly, we've worked on grouping selector, just the way we have it in this first illustration. We've worked on grouping selector, we grouped the paragraph and the li on the same selector. So that's it about the grouping selector. If you want to add any other one, you can put a comma and you add it. Okay, let's see whether we have an anchor. Okay, yeah, we have an anchor tag here. So obviously what we have here will be reflecting on that anchor tag. Now let's go back there and check for our anchor tag. Our anchor tag is the next page. Now let's reload. Okay, so we see reflecting on the next page also. We see that the color is now red. We see that the line height is 2 and the letter spacing is 2 pixel. So that's all you need to know. Lastly, we are going to work on the universal selector. Universal selector selects all the elements on the page. Now, what do we use to characterize the universal selector? So we use the asterisk. Now the asterisk, alright, so we use the asterisk. Now let's open our curly brace. Now we're going to give it a background color of black, okay, and we're going to give it a color which is the text color of white. Now let's see how this goes. Okay, so we talked about the universal selector. I explained that to you initially, so let's check what's going to give us. So I'm going to reload the page. Oh, so you see that everything we have on that page has been affected because of the universal selector. Okay, so let's expand this. Okay, so the whole page is having a black background color, and the text we have here has been changed to white. Okay, so that's it about the universal selector. It's very easy, very effectively used, so selecting the entire page and styling it. Okay, so we talked about the grouping, we've talked about class selector, ID selector, and element selector. So thank you very much for your time, and see you next class.